Thank you all for joining us for this special Wednesday afternoon edition of Tuesday Race Talks. I am delighted and honored to be here to host this important and timely conversation. I should note as well that the month of May is Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month, but also that this conversation would be relevant during any month. And while recent acts of violence targeting Asian Americans are a catalyst for this conversation, let me be clear that Asian Americans have been and continue to be central to the drama of the ongoing project of American democracy. A central purpose of all of these conversations, the Tuesday Race Talk series, is to situate current events and developments, and in particular legal issues, in the broader context that generate them. So today, our plan is to begin with the here and now, what's going on right now, but then to also give you a way to understand why we are where we are in the here and now. We want to reach beyond current events to consider the broader, or if you will, deeper cultural, social, political factors of which current events are an expression. This will include some examination of history, because as we all know, and as one of my favorite writers was fond of saying, the past ain't even past. We carry it within us, so much so that it is literally present in all that we do. It provides our frames of reference, our identities, and our aspirations. With these thoughts in mind, I turn to our two esteemed speakers. We're delighted to have with us Aarti Kohli and Cynthia Choi. Aarti Kohli is the Executive Director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice, the Asian Law Caucus. The Asian Law Caucus is the first organization in the country to represent and promote the legal and civil rights of Asian American and Pacific Islander communities. Aarti is an experienced leader with over 20 years of experience at the intersection of immigration, civic engagement, criminal justice, economic equity, and national security. In her leadership role at the Asian Law Caucus, she brings a vision of increasing the power of low-income immigrant communities in order to advance economic and racial justice. And as listeners to the Tuesday Race Talk knows, one of our core principles is that economic and racial justice are actually central to the viability of democracy, which is to say that our democracy will not be sustainable unless we can make progress with respect to economic and racial justice. Aarti is committed to advancing local, state, and federal policy solutions that recognize and address the needs of the Asian American and Pacific Islander communities. Thank you, Aarti, so much for joining us today for this conversation. We're also honored to have with us Cynthia Choi, who is the co-executive director of Chinese for Affirmative Action, which is a community-based civil rights organization committed to protecting the dignity and fair treatment of all immigrants and fulfilling the promise of a multiracial democracy. Chinese for Affirmative Action is one of the founders of Stop AAPI Hate, an initiative that was formed to address anti-Asian racism and xenophobia, all too apparent in recent weeks and months. Cynthia has over 30 years of experience working in the nonprofit sector and over 20 years serving in leadership positions. She has led local, state, and national community-based organizations working on a range of issues, from reproductive justice and gender violence, to violence prevention, to immigrant and refugee rights, and also environmental justice issues. We are pleased, honored to be able to have two local leaders with such broad and deep experience in these issues. So thank you for joining us for this conversation. Let me start, for people who maybe haven't been watching the news or have only sparingly been watching the news, let's start with the question of where are we now with respect to anti-Asian violence. Cynthia, can you give us a sense of what's been going on lately, both in the Bay Area, California, and throughout the nation?
Well, first, I just want to say thank you so much for the invitation, especially shout out to Diane Chin, who was the former executive director of Chinese for Affirmative Action. So I'm really standing on her shoulders, and Rick for hosting this conversation. I think this is so important. And just on a lighter note, I almost had a heart attack when I saw that it was the Tuesday race talk, and I thought I got the date wrong. So just on a lighter note, I'm glad that it was actually on a Wednesday, your Tuesday talk. So I do want to take a moment to just share my screen and make sure it's in presentation mode and take a minute. What I wanted to share is that this reporting center, which we started in March of last year, really was in response to news accounts and social media accounts of largely Asian Americans, some Pacific Islanders, being attacked. And we saw a surge in COVID-19 related racism. And obviously this is not a new issue to our community, but we started tracking it to really start to, really in efforts to understand what was happening, the nature of it, the magnitude. And we modeled our reporting center off of the Southern Poverty Law Center, and made some adjustments. And what we saw very high level, and I can offer as much detail as you wanted, this is firsthand accounts, firsthand witness accounts of hate, and it's verbal harassment, discriminatory treatment. We just released our latest numbers, which is 6,600, over 6,600 incidents of hate. And we're very careful to use that broad frame of hate incidents, and because the majority of the incidents that we're getting on our site are actually not hate crimes. And both Aarti and I can talk more about the definitions and some of the history around that work. Both of our organizations have had a long history in addressing racial inequality, racism, and violence. And what we're seeing is a systemic, it's widespread. We're getting incident reports from throughout the nation. California and New York have the highest number of incidents. We are seeing that all AAPIs are being targeted and subjected. But we do have some groups that are reporting in higher numbers, Chinese being the leading number. But you know, close to 60% are non-Chinese, even though the intended target are Chinese themselves. And not surprisingly to women and women of color, we are seeing close to 65% of the incidents of the respondents are women. And about 11 incidents pertaining to young people 0 to 17, and roughly 7% affecting the elderly. I'll stop sharing just so I'd like to see her faces. And really, I think what's important to note is that, again, while this is not new, this is certainly unprecedented in terms of the levels. These are not microaggressions. This is palpable hate that has been catalyzed by COVID, and really a history of scapegoating immigrants, people of color. And at this particular time, the target are Chinese. But as you can see, you know, racism is affecting all of our communities and in different ways. And so we are seeing things, a majority of the incidents are verbal harassment. So while people are going to the grocery store, on public streets, walking in their neighborhoods, they're being verbally harassed, told to go back to China, you know, racist slurs. And for women, the verbal harassment and attacks are gendered. COVID is being weaponized to sexually harass. And then we're seeing workplace discrimination, refusal of service. We are seeing incidents on public transit. And there have been a lot of news accounts of Asians being violently attacked. We don't always know if they're racially motivated. And obviously, many of you are well aware that of the charges with regard to the Atlanta area shootings, and certainly what happened in what has happened in Indianapolis, and what we're finding out during the investigation around that. So, needless to say, this is a devastating time. And I think it's an important conversation, that we're having at this moment.
Let me ask you a couple of follow-up questions. First of all, how are these incidents reported? Are people reporting these on a website? Because the hate incidents, almost by definition, they're not going to law enforcement, presumably. So what's the database? How is the information collected? Let me give you a couple different issues. How is the information collected? How does the situation over the last year, do we know how that compares to earlier years? How much of an upsurge has there been? Do we have that sort of data? And then finally, the numbers in California, New York, are those higher simply because there are more Asian Americans in those states, or are they higher on a proportional basis as well?
Yeah, so very simple response to your question is we have a website that is in 11 different languages other than English. We just added Spanish, so we're really happy about that. And we are continuing to add other languages based on request and need. And Rick, you raised a really good point. We do not share our information to third parties. We do not share our information with law enforcement. In large part because there is no law enforcement response. If they are not hate crimes, but rather hate incidents, and obviously hate speech is protected speech, there really isn't a law enforcement role. That doesn't mean there shouldn't be a response to racial discrimination. Obviously, there's civil rights protections that need to be pursued, and there's remedies along those lines, especially in California. But I think, so that's a very important note to lift up, that we again do not hand over any information to anybody, especially without their permission. So very few people come onto our site to report an active, urgent emergency situation. We're not a hotline or even a warm line. We are collecting this data to really provide resources after the fact, and also, I think, to make policy recommendations, focus on public education, and other initiatives. And for those who are in an emergency or urgent situation, they likely are already calling 911 for urgent matters. And then with regard to California and New York, we can't actually say why the numbers are so high in California and New York. I mean, a lot of people are saying, well, is it because of the high numbers, the significant populations? I also think it has to do with media coverage. We have huge media markets. There are a lot of people who don't know about our reporting center. And so another piece of that is we feel this is an undercount of what's actually happening to people in their daily lives. And Aarti, I think, would probably be in the best position to talk about prior to us starting the reporting center, to do some comparisons to prior years. But I think we've maintained that this is not an accurate account. We think it's more like a canary in the coal mine of what's actually happening to people in their daily lives. And we know, for example, that the primary responders are English speakers. And so, we're not capturing what's happening in immigrant communities, LEP communities, elders, there's a digital divide. So there are lots of stories and incidents that we're not able to capture because of those historic barriers. And just a distrust, even with nonprofits, right, where we have a presence, where we provide services, there is absolutely no trust with law enforcement and other government entities, especially in recent years where we've seen law enforcement and government actually um, uh, have broken the trust of communities and have been actually hostile towards our communities with regard to immigration and the criminal justice system. So, Aarti, do you want to answer the question about comparison?
Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, this is, let me just frame it. Is there really more bad stuff happening now, or are we just more aware of it? What's your sense?
I think there is more bad stuff happening now, but it's cyclical. So if we go back to post 9/11, the targets were different. It was people perceived to be Muslim, and you have this South Asian, Sikh communities, Arab, Middle Eastern folks, all being targeted post 9/11. And you saw the same thing, actually, that women were targeted more than men. So I think there is something there as well. But the problem back then exists today, which is the data is very unreliable. There's no national way of collecting it. Relying on law enforcement to be the ones who collect it has been shown over and over again to be not a good use of resources. And so that's been the challenge. We actually had a reporting center, standagainsthatred.org, which we started in 2016 around the election, because there was a lot of anti-immigrant rhetoric and also anti-China rhetoric, which was impacting Asian American communities. And so we saw, I think the rise started then. And then it really increased dramatically under COVID. And obviously the rhetoric, Kung flu, all these things, the China virus contributed to the rise. But definitely these incidents have been happening all along. And so I want to make sure that we acknowledge that. I think there has been an increase.
Let me ask you, so to what extent do you think, you can see how the Kung flu and all that sort of stuff would lead to hate incidents or even hate violence, hate-based violence. But, to what extent is the problem rooted in those sort of recent conversations versus sort of long-standing issues related to Asian Americans and American society? Aarti, can you give us some sense of that?
Yeah, I mean, this goes back generations for us, right? You starting with the Chinese Exclusion Act and the Asiatic barred zones in California. We had alien land laws. Those are were aimed at Japanese Americans. And so this idea of us as perpetual foreigners has always been a part of the narrative around Asian Americans in this country. And you see the progression of it, from the late 1800s to, Japanese American internment, right? We were seen as a national security threat. And then you have the decline of the American auto industry, which led to the death of Vincent Chin, who was killed by 2 auto workers who thought he was Japanese American and blamed him for losing their jobs. And they literally beat him to death. And then you have 9/11. So this is a pattern of us always being otherized. And it's something that, we have to work really hard to fight. And that's, I think, the work that Cynthia and I do day in, day out.
Yeah, Yeah, those historical roots are easy to overlook, and I find that a lot of students, frankly, are unaware of those historical roots. And even I remind my students, even close to home, if we cross El Camino at Stanford and go into the residential neighborhood, the moment you do that, you're in a neighborhood that actually had restrictive covenants barring ownership, not only by Black people, but by any people, quote, of the Mongolian race. They were barred from owning land in the neighborhood. And, this is in California. And, when we look beyond California, it is the case that we've long had a struggle about who can be a citizen of the nation. And this longstanding issue of whether one had to be, as the federal statute said, a quote, free white person to be eligible for naturalization. And that free white person requirement, which was actually a part of naturalization law for the bulk of our history, in fact, going into the 20th century, that was something that was explicitly meant to exclude Asians from the opportunity to become citizens. So, so there are some roots here that are pretty deep. Cynthia, what do you all? How do you know? One would hope that looking at this history, though, going back to the 19th century and the railroads and the Chinese exclusion laws and alien land laws and the requirement that you be white to be a citizen, you would hope that we would have left all that behind, right? Now we're 50 years past the civil rights movement, the liberalization of immigration law with the 1965 Immigration Act. Why is it that we're sort of still here with these issues rather than them having faded away over time? What's keeping this stuff alive, you think?
Well, I think, right. I mean, I think, both you and Aarti talked about the fact that this actually defines our experience, right? And that our status is conditional, and that there has been a history of dehumanization, vilification, and scapegoating. And that has been our work. I mean, if you think about the role of community-based organizations, of advocacy organizations like Asian Law Caucus and CAA, it has been about trying to fulfill this promise of a multiracial democracy, right? And the thing that I think is incredibly important is to recognize that it's taken all of us as a movement, as a country, to recognize the unalienable rights of every person. And it's true, if you look back, I mean, we have been told where we could live, who we could love, what businesses we could own, whether or not we actually belonged here, whether or not we had fundamental civil rights and human rights. And this continues to be our fight. And now I think what's really important to recognize is, and perhaps poignant to lift up, is US foreign policy and how that's always affected the treatment of Asians in this country. And if you look at, for example, militarization, World War II, Vietnam, the Korean War, the fact that we have rhetoric today by both parties, may I add, that are painting China as an existential threat to our nation, that will continue to sow distrust and the scapegoating. I mean, how does it occur that all of a sudden neighbors, schoolmates, coworkers across the country see Asians as a threat, are blaming Asians for that? This doesn't happen overnight. Yes, it is the rhetoric, but there has to be a through line, the social conditioning, the otherization that I think Aarti talked about, that has always been undergirding our society, in the same way that the racist stereotypes and ideologies exist against the Black community, the Latinx, Indigenous, and others who've been targeted. So I think that this is something, when we talk about a racial reckoning, that includes us, that includes the fact that our movement has really always been about recognizing structural discrimination and how we've been pitted against each other in attempts to deny that. And I think that's the moment, that we're in.
Okay, so this is, you got a lot there. Aarti, what do you think about this idea that China, and there is some people are saying that we're going to be in the midst of a kind of a new Cold War.
Cold War, yeah.
Between the U.S. and China, and China has, they have a lot more people than we do, and they're expanding their influence across the world. And there's this question of, what does this mean for the United States? Are the dynamics between the U.S. and China and that competition, if you will, is that going to shape, cultural understanding, social perceptions in the United States of Asian Americans?
Well, I mean, they already have. You have the Department of Justice has a China initiative. And what they're doing right now is prosecuting Chinese scientists and for paperwork violations, really. People who have grants with Chinese institutions, researchers who've come here on visas, saying that they've committed visa fraud because they haven't disclosed each and every interaction with the Chinese military or government. So this is happening, and this has been happening for years now. And we are really concerned. I mean, we're both human rights advocates. So we're not here to justify the actions of a government that has oppressed people, has harmed people. But we do have, our job is to ensure that the civil rights of communities here are protected. And so I have deep concern, because a lot of this flows from culture and narrative, right? Who defines the narrative of threat? And if our leaders are defining the threat as, they think they're defining the threat as the government of China, but it really translates to people here as anybody perceived to be Chinese in the United States. And so, and we've seen this happen over and over again, post 9/11, that's what happened. And so, people can't absolve themselves of that responsibility in terms of how they frame the issue.
Okay, wow. Let me pick up a couple of questions from the chat, one of which you links to your comments just now. So we've been talking mostly about Chinese Americans, right? And the implications of the U.S. competition with China. Some of our listeners want to know, how useful is it to even group together all the different categories of Asian American, or even a group Asian American along with Pacific Islander?
Absolutely.
Is that a coherent group? Are there the same dynamics? Do they confront the same issues? Or should we be talking with more granularity about different groups?
So Asian American and Pacific Islander is a political identity, right? And so it's an opportunity for us to build power together, but we do have to be very mindful that it creates invisibility within the grouping. So we are the racial minority in the country with the widest wealth gap. So we have some of the wealthiest people, and then we have some of the most vulnerable and some of the poorest. And that definitely gets hidden under this identity of Asian American and Pacific Islander. And we have to work hard every day to center the experiences of the most vulnerable within that grouping. And I have to tell you, it's a real challenge for me. I'm South Asian. You know, I think about every day, how can I do a good job representing this wide diversity of our communities? And part of how we do it at Asian Law Caucus is we really try and create platforms for directly impacted people to advocate for themselves and to tell their own stories, rather than speaking for them. And that's, you know, a hard balance to strike. In our own office, we're looking to ensure that we have that diversity within our staff. I actually have 2 formerly incarcerated Southeast Asian community members as part of our staff. And so we really want our work to be led by people who are being impacted by the systems that we're trying to change.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, and if I could add, I mean, I think that's such a fundamental question for us. I mean, this moment of anti-Asian racism, unprecedented levels, has also brought us together in ways that I think are so powerful, including this longstanding issue of how this political identity in some ways has caused harm and erasure of those that are lesser visible. And I'm, you know, specifically the Southeast Asian communities and Pacific Islander communities. I'm learning a lot with these listening sessions that we're having with the PI community, even within the PI umbrella of those that are invisible under that identity. And so I think this has been a powerful moment in the sense that these conversations, while longstanding, require attention and interrogation of how we make sure that there's equitable distribution, how we're visibilizing, and as Aarti said, having people speak for themselves, especially those who are impacted. And so I think it is important to have more representation and those authentic conversations about how violence affects them in different ways, institutional. And I think it's extremely important that that's also very much a part of our conversation as well.
Yeah, no, this is something that a lot of people are wondering about because, you know, I mean, people might, I think, wonder like how related is the experience of a Filipino to a Chinese American. And it's just not clear that those are actually part of one experience. And then I wonder if another thing complicating the political identity is the fact that even within the sort of subgroups of Asian American, there is, sometimes tension within those groups. And you can tell me if that's incorrect, but that's my sense that there's tension within those groups as well. Is that something that affects the coalition or the ability to work together?
Okay, so there's a lot in that question. Let me try and see if I can start, and then Cindy, if you want to chime in. So in terms of how related it is an experience, I would say one thing to acknowledge is that whether you're Filipino or Chinese or South Asian, there are people of different classes here. So we have clients who are Filipino caregivers, Chinese caregivers, South Asian caregivers. Their experiences are pretty similar in terms of what they're dealing with, in terms of access to PPP, trying to get, benefits through the Cal EDD, all of these barriers to economic justice that they're encountering. So, were their migrations different? Yeah, probably. But, do we all come from colonized lands? Yeah. So there's both things in common, and then there are differences. In terms of tension, I would say if the tensions tend to reside more within the generation that is the first generation that immigrates, where there might have been tensions back in the homeland or between, nations in Asia. But as our generations, as you have second generation or third generation folks, that I don't see as much. What I sometimes see as a tension is, and this is, as a South Asian, I think there is this conversation that happens between South Asians and East Asians, and West Asians, for lack of a better word.
Actually, I'm not sure who the West Asians are. The West Asians.
Well, I mean, you could go pretty far west. You want to go past Pakistan, you can go to Iran, you can go, it's like, that's also, there's questions about how far you want to. At Asian Law Caucus, we work really, the communities we work with, we have a term called AMEMSA, Arab, Middle Eastern, Muslim, South Asian, and that's for our national security work. And so, we want to be very inclusive in our definition of Asian and Pacific Islander. But this idea of being brown, or I just came from a conversation with Riz Ahmed, the actor, and he's from Britain, and he was talking about how Asian in Britain is South Asian, not East Asian, and that they were all, I think the term, they were all seen as Black. And so that, who the diversity of that community. So of immigrant communities and Black Britishers. And so, these are sort of some of the things that we have to navigate, which is what, sort of the culture, the mainstream narrative puts on us, and how we also define ourselves. And one of the things that I was recently presenting to an Indian group, and they were not South Asian, they called themselves Indian. And it was great because there was this conversation and recognition of sort of being a part of the Asian American community and talking about other Asian American communities, the Vietnamese community, the Korean community. And I was just so heartened to see that there is this desire to build power together. And okay, so we have this frame put upon us, right? Whether it's by the census or policymakers. Let's use it. Let's leverage it. We're the fastest growing racial minority in this country. By 2050, we're going to be 10% of the population in a majority minority country. So we have great power that we can wield.
Yeah. Let me follow up with Aarti, I want to stay with you on that though, and then go to Cynthia to get your view on this too. That one of the things that's striking. I mean, we're talking about violence against Asian Americans, which has been all over the news, right? Incidents captured on video. It is easy to see that this is a problem, but it does seem that both now and more generally in terms of the sort of historically, there's been less political activism by Asian Americans than say there has been with African Americans, right? That there is, you talk about Asian American as a political identity, but it seems as though there's much less political sort of assertion of political power or calling on political powers that be to do something than in the case of African Americans. So what are we to make of that difference? I mean, what explains that? How are we to understand that? What do you make of that, Aarti? And you can tell me that's incorrect, right? Maybe, but.
Well, coming from an organization that were the original activists and were, fighting the power day in, day out, I think part of it isn't quite accurate in the sense that there has always been activism in the Asian American community. I mean, if you think of, for the lawyers in the room, you know, some of the big cases, cases on birthright citizenship, on you know, other immigration issues, those were brought by Asian American plaintiffs, right? So it's not that Asian Americans never challenged, you know, the laws that were oppressing us or the, you know, policies. It's just that historically we've been very small. And part of it was that we were barred from this country until the doors opened in post 65 is when you have you know, the big increase in migration. And I think, acknowledge a lot of Asian Americans talk about this, where there is an aspect of the culture, which is keep your head down, you know, just power through. And that is something that a lot of, you know, elders have said to their kids, you know, don't rock the boat. And I will, you know, I want to acknowledge that while we deal with, and, you know, we work on sort of the most vulnerable folks who are economically disadvantaged, Asians of all economic strata have experienced racism in this country. It is so normalized for us. People don't even realize how many times, and people have been told to go back to their country, their food has been made fun of, their clothing, anything, their otherness. I have, you know, most of the Asian Americans of my generation dealt with some sort of bullying at school. Particularly when if they were raised in, they were in an environment that, you know, where they were a minority. And so I think, you know, I've heard this term white adjacent, so as referring to Asian Americans, the racial strata and hierarchy, and that we are up there. And that's just like, does not speak to the real life experience of Asian Americans that I know, and it's incredibly harmful, right? It's part of those divisive politics, and so yeah. I mean, I think, Cyn, do you want to chime in here?
Yeah, I mean, there was a part of me was like, I was just like cringing, like, you know, because both of our organizations were founded by hardcore activists, social workers, and were inspired by the Black Civil Rights Movement. You know, quite honestly, our founders adopted, you know, political strategies, movement strategies, peaceful protests. All of that is part of our DNA and part of doing this work in coalition, you know, with other affected communities. And Aarti's absolutely right. I mean, our activism runs deep in the sense that the work that we've done hasn't just benefited our community, but it's benefited others. Like, for example, our organization was involved in Lau v. Nichols, which went all the way to the Supreme Court, guaranteeing limited English-speaking children of all different groups the right to a quality education. And so, and a lot of people don't know, in the early 1800s, there were actually civil rights activity that was going on. They filed lawsuits against the Exclusion Acts and the series of laws that was preventing them from making a living, and so forth. And so, and circumventing the ban, right, through using, circumventing the immigration laws and the bans at that time. So not only has our community been activated, but they've used every means available to them, especially when there have been unjust laws and policies. And so I think that that's really important to recognize. That being said, I do feel as though there is a level of activism that I haven't seen in my lifetime, where you have people asking themselves, what can I do in my workplace, in my school community, in my neighborhood? And that's incredibly inspiring, you know, to see that. And I see that what we're witnessing at this time, we're hoping to further expand to not just looking at these horrific interpersonal attacks, which I think has really outraged so many, so we can kind of convert that into other forms of political action that are going to really address these issues at a systemic level. And so what I saw in Georgia in terms of mobilizing the Asian American vote there, Aarti's partner and affiliate there who led years and years of voter mobilization and education that has made a difference in our ability to make change with this administration, quite frankly. And so we have always been overlooked and undervalued in terms of our role, our participation. But the fact also is that we're actually young, relatively young in terms of our infrastructure and political participation, in large part because of barriers around our status in terms of being able to vote. But I will say that there are moments in our history, for example, I believe the Japanese American internment experience mobilized and politicized the Japanese American community in a way that is unparalleled, right? And so you're seeing many parts of that community speak out against the Muslim ban, speaking out about the separation of families at the border. I know in the Chinese community, we have rallied against the Muslim ban because we know we were also banned. We were also painted as an existential threat. And you see moments of like that. After the uprising in LA, we saw the Korean community become more civically engaged, run for office, build organizations that were really focused on political activism. So you're seeing a maturation of our communities. And for the first time, we're seeing some investments in our communities that will hopefully not be fleeting.
Okay, no, these are great issues. Let me ask you, in this, with this recent spate of violence, how much or little support have you received from people who are not Asian American, right, or Pacific Islander? One of the things that was striking with the Black Lives Matter movement in the recent iterations, right, is that after the killing of George Floyd, is that you would see people of all backgrounds at various protests. There were protests overseas in other countries, and there was a really broad sort of reckoning there. What sort of response have you had from people outside of the Asian American community in response to these violent acts? Cynthia. Well, no, Aarti. Go ahead, Aarti. Because your screen lit up first. You got it.
Okay. Well, I think there has been recognition from a lot of folks who are not Asian. I mean, I've gotten messages from folks. I've gotten, I think corporations have really stepped up. A lot of that is actually, I mean, part of it is they have Asian employee resource groups and Asian, staff who are like, this is an issue we have to pay attention to. It is within this, I think, as Sin said earlier about the United States having a racial reckoning, right? It is within this frame of racial equity and this recognition that our communities are actually people of color, right, who are being harmed. I do see that that's happening. I think at the same time that that's happening, there was a report on philanthropy. And if you know, nonprofits, that most of us rely on either government contracts or foundations for our resources. And philanthropy foundations have the data basically said 0.2% of foundation dollars go to Asian American communities. 0.2%. That's ridiculously low. given our population, and given, the fact that we have some of the most vulnerable, folks in this country are part of our communities. And so I think, while this spate of, rapid response, dollars is really, I think people appreciate that. But what we really need is long-term investment. And that has to come from these systems and structures that were supposed to be investing in us and haven't been. And so that's the work that we need to do. And Sin and I, both our organizations are privileged in that we are some of the more bigger organizations, but we work with grassroots partners who have very little. And we both, I know, having had conversations with Sin, feel a deep responsibility to our partners, because our work isn't done alone. And so I think, I'm deeply committed to ensuring that there are more resources to the field and the movement space of Asian American and Pacific Islander organizations.
And how about the, we talked earlier about the sort of coalition within the broad umbrella of Asian American. Let's broaden that even more and, think about African Americans on the one hand and also, Muslims on the other. Because, we not only have issues of anti-Asian violence, we also have, anti-Black racism, as we see in the policing context. There also is an issue with Islamophobia, and which, Cynthia, I think you referenced. So what are the possibilities and the impediments to broader coalition, partnership, working together with these other groups around common interests? Cynthia, what do you think about that? Are we, where are things now? Where could they be? What are the impediments to progress there?
Well, I think this is, while it's a very dark time and a difficult time, out of crisis, I think there's opportunity. Sometimes you just have to tear things down to the ground and rebuild them. And I think we're in that moment. I think that what I would want to lift up is that there has
what precisely are we tearing down, though? What are we tearing down? What are you trying to build up?
Well, for example, on the issues of public safety, right? This has been an issue, a longstanding issue in our community around crime, around punishment, around policing. And this is just one of many, right? And in our community, there's been also this narrative of a good immigrant versus bad immigrant. And there is racial bias within our communities and across our communities. And we just have to acknowledge that. And I think that's incredibly important as we move forward. And this is actually when Aarti and I talk about like day in and day out, we are trying to figure out how do we engage our communities around anti-Blackness, around classism, around Islamophobia. What's different, I think, about this period than other periods, because there have been waves, that we talked about, is the role of social media and disinformation. We've always had discrimination and hate, but the speed in which it's taking place, that it's, these spaces that are in our communities predominantly sharing misinformation, myths that are perpetuating, racist ideologies. This is a real problem for us. And it's not just in Asian spaces either. I mean, look at what's happening in our country, where there are people who still think that, the president of the United States is not a legitimate president. So this is not unique to our community. But this is the stuff that we, I think, have to confront. So for me, I think what's inspiring is the fact that we have to have these conversations. With regard to the public safety issues, one of the reasons why we're capturing this data and really trying to paint an accurate picture of what's actually happening by our data, which is that 90% of the incidents are not hate crimes. There's no one profile. It is not all Black people who are attacking Asians. And yet we know that data and evidence is not enough, right, in an environment of disinformation. So I think it's important that we work on this issue with each other and within our communities. And even before the pandemic, we have been working on very concrete levels to build relationships with each other, build understanding, and to do this work jointly. And that has to focus on issues of equity. I mean, locally here in the Bay Area, we have been working on longstanding issues of racial tensions between the Chinese and the Black community that really have to do with issues around poverty and lack of access to opportunities, and the racial bias that exists within our communities. And that work will take time. We finally have investments to actually do this kind of joint work together, starting
Could you give some concrete examples of that? What sort of projects do you have in mind there to address the interracial?
Yeah, I'd love to. So we're part of a coalition that is really focused on addressing the immediate harm. So we're seeing violent attacks, people being victimized. So we have to center them first. We have to make sure that they get services and support in language, that it's accessible, and to recognize that it's the impacts of violence and racial trauma is lasting. We have to make sure that and we're working on investments around intervention and prevention, because we want to get ahead of these issues from happening in the first place. And we are asking for the city to invest in the racial healing and solidarity work. And the truth of the matter is, these incidents are happening in low-income neighborhoods and communities where we have communities whose basic needs are not being met. And we have mountains of data that show us that the drivers around violence and crime have to do with poverty. And that is what we need to get to. But before that, before we can actually bring communities together, neighbors together, we really have to create space around the healing trauma work that's really going to be important. So right now, there's lots of tensions around terms like defund the police. People in the Asian community, in immigrant communities, they don't actually know what that means. And it's creating a sense of fear and insecurity. But when we talk to them about the fact that we need more jobs, we need more affordable housing, we need to make sure that people who have mental health issues are supported, those are things that they support. And so I can't stress enough how difficult and how painstakingly slow that work is, because we're talking about undoing so much social conditioning that's embedded everywhere, from our public schools, in the workplace, and just more broadly. And so that's what I'm talking about in terms of the concrete work that needs to happen.
Okay, and Aarti, so we're approaching the end of our session, and we want to try to we like to try to end a little bit with some optimism and some positive steps that people can take. Aarti, what do you think needs to happen, and who needs to do it?
We all have a responsibility in this. So what I think we need to do is everyone needs to examine their own role. And it doesn't have to be that you go out and become an activist. You can, we are offering bystander intervention trainings So individuals, if you want to, learn how to safely intervene if you are witnessing an act of hate, you can get trained on that. So that's something people can do. Everyone should be checking in on their friends and colleagues. I can't emphasize enough how much trauma there is. I'll talk to someone and they'll say, "Oh, I'm afraid for my mom to go walk out the door." It's weighing heavily on people. So that individually people can do. You can look to your own backyard. California in particular, we have a great diversity of Asian American AAPI organizations, health organizations, civil rights, whatever, take a look. If you want to donate, volunteer, you can do that. Then as a community, we have to, I think one of the things about violence is, and hate is that we all have to take responsibilities as a community. And so look at systems that we interact with. Some of these incidents pre-COVID were happening in schools. So what structures do we have? We think things like restorative circles, restorative justice, those kinds of these kinds of systems to address hate that don't lead to further criminalization is important. Because one of the things you realize is once someone gets sent to prison, so many prisons are segregated by race. Mm-hmm. So you're not actually getting at this underlying, issue of the hate, right? There's no rehabilitation. There's no apology to the person who was harmed. So one of the things that we've been really pushing is investment in restorative justice as one of the things that we need to do both at the state and federal level. And I think Sin pointed this out too, is that victim support is minimal. And particularly if something doesn't even rise to the level of a crime, what happens to that person who's traumatized? Can they get mental health support? Can they get, if they're harmed in some way, can they access a victims fund? All of that is very hard, particularly for people who are limited English speaking. So one of the things we're doing is advocating for legislation in California that would improve access to victims funds. So all of these, there's a layer of things, both in terms of prevention and intervention. And we really have to reimagine. This is the moment. Our current systems are failing us. They're not adequate. How can we as a community seek safety from a system that is killing people? Like, that's not okay. So, as we, try and seek safety for victims, seek accountability, we have to build new structures. And I think that's the opportunity here.
Wow. Okay. We just have a couple of minutes left here. The closing remarks, whatever you would like, but are there any particular, we have a lot of students, young people who are listening, any particular encouragement, insights, words of wisdom you'd like to offer to young lawyers or undergrads who might be listening? Cynthia?
Well, it's an incredibly inspiring, because what we're seeing is a level of activism, as I said before, that I haven't seen before. But, Aarti, our generation was inspired by previous periods of trauma, and our desire to be a part of the community and solution. I've talked to so many elected officials and attorneys who pursued those avenues because of Vincent Chin. because of, and I would say that we're still reeling from that racial trauma of not being recognized as human beings. And I think since that period, there has been a real concerted effort to really ask ourselves, well, what's my role? What can I actually do? So we saw so many people go into teaching in ethnic studies. I feel like historians are flanking me when they retell. I mean, there's a saying that history doesn't teach us, it's historians, right? We're seeing people go into the legal profession as public interest attorneys. I think so many people, as Aarti has said, has asked themselves, well, what can I do? You don't have to become a full-time activist like Aarti and I are. But I think this is a moment, and I'm watching my two youngest or two eldest who are in their 20s, and they were out on the streets, right? And they told me this says, I want to be able to tell my kids that when this happened, I was there and I spoke out. And I think it's incredibly important, especially since we're speaking to law school students, that you can go to law school, lawyer, and I have so many friends who actually didn't go into practicing law, but using that skill set to advocate. And that's been incredibly an incredible contribution to our movement and to the communities that we serve and work with.
Wonderful. Aarti, would you, anything to add there?
Well, I would just say that I'm inspired by the young people of today. I feel like they're leading me. I'm not leading them. And I have deep hope because of that. I see that the youth today see themselves as whole intersectional beings, and they understand solidarity in a way that is far deeper than my generation. And so I'm looking to them to lead the way.
Okay. And I think we have a website that we may want to refer people to.
Yeah, so it's called, it's aapisrising.org. I can put it in the chat. I don't know. Oh, I'm not sure if anybody can see it.
No, people can remember that though, aapisrising.org.
aapisrising.org. And it's to that point that you were asking, it's to celebrate API Heritage Month. There are events that people can get involved in. There will be solidarity stories. The theme is resistance is our heritage. So, you know, we're standing on the shoulders of others as we do this work.
Okay, that's a good note to close on. Thank you, Aarti Kohli and Cynthia Choi, so much for joining us for this special Wednesday edition of Tuesday Race Talks to give us more insight into issues that are both pressing, immediate, and timely, but also very enduring. That is the end of the show for today. You all have a great afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.